Thank you, opening house. Let's go to the closing side of the debate, which we would like to invite the member of government to the podium.
Member of government.
Madam Speaker, I want to applaud CAU1 for being the only first Jungong team to come to the grand finals in NEAO. Unfortunately, they were unable to provide us a good case for the CG to deal with because they have a very confused stance about humanitarian intervention, ladies and gentlemen. On one hand, they said, look at Libya, there was an international consensus, so we can reach that. And on the other hand, they say, no, look at Libya, it's a very controversial intervention. And then they tell us, A, well, United Nations Security Council is a really good place where consensus is made. And then B, he ends with, United Nations has no power, remember, ladies and gentlemen. So again, we have a very confused opening opposition that doesn't quite understand what kind of crises are happening in the world today and how international organizations or regional blocs have been unable to stop such horrendous events from taking place. The closing government believes that ultimately we should have, if we do have willing and capable parties, willing and capable to engage to stop people from being dead, from stopping people from being persecuted, we should absolutely grant them the right under the mechanism of international law. So as the closing government, our extension will be elaboration upon why humanitarian crises is an urgent issue that when a willing, capable party exists, should be granted the rights. Furthermore, we're going to talk about what kind of willing powers exist and what kind of history we've had with humanitarian interventions, and furthermore about the impact of this policy. So let's go to rebuttals one by one. They tell us, number one, look at US and Somalia, that you can't really change anything and you're not really doing anything. Number one, we think it's absolutely foolish to say that you're not changing anything in Somalia. We believe that when you see Somalian pirates decreasing in number, when you see a bit of stability, we're not saying Somalia is a perfect place, but when we see stability getting achieved gradually through intervention of other states in Somalia, we think that success is on their way. Furthermore, they tell us, people can't, answering to Mingyong's POI, well, you can't solve it anyway. So what exactly is CAU trying to promote to us, saying that, well, humanitarian crises are A, not really worth solving, or B, you can't do it, therefore let's not do anything about it, because after all, Africa is a very far place. We think it's really irresponsible for the opening opposition to simply deny this urgency, and I'll go on to that later. But furthermore, they talk about consensus. Now, they really seem to like the word consensus. Number one, international consensus. I think the opening government did a pretty good job explaining why international mechanisms within the Security Council can't reach that international consensus due to political reasons. And then they tell us domestic consensus. Wait until the Tutsis and Hutus agree to not hate each other, and we'll let them solve it. That's what happened in Rwanda when 6,000 or 8,000 people died per day by their very own government. So we think it's really foolish, again, and naive to have a domestic consensus reach for a solution. Closing.
Rwanda right now actually is able to develop in a way that these people got tired of fighting and now they actually want peace by themselves.
Yay. My goodness, in the grand final somebody telling us, they got tired of killing like millions and millions of people, so let's wait until millions and millions are dead, therefore peace will come. We think that wasn't sit down and see. We don't think that peace was a peace that we want. We want peace now when people are getting killed off for absolutely no reason. We don't want to wait until there's nobody else to kill, therefore peace comes. We think that's very foolish of the closing opposition. Anyway, so let's move on to my extension. Now, first about the urgency. Now, Madam Speaker, we believe the urgency exists, especially in the previous cases of Rwanda and Darfur, when the ruling government actually promoted mass killing of a specific ethnic group or a specific group within the society. We think it's really foolish for them to tell us that, genocide is really vague anyway, let's not deal with it. Because, Madam Speaker, we think that this is an urgent matter that the international society needs to take over. Unfortunately, however, we've seen conflicts between Russia, China, US, UK, and France, and all of them within the Security Council, to not really take action. But we tell you, sit down, we tell you when European states were willing to go into Darfur and Rwanda, when the European powers were willing to actually take some action, we've seen other big powers stop it. That's the injustice we see in the society. Because, Madam Speaker, we think law is about addressing urgent issues that are pressing into the society. We think if there's a willing and capable power to do so, you should be getting that granted right. We don't see any justification or rationale whatsoever for, P5 nations to twiddle their thumbs and let, peace come by having everybody dead, because we simply don't see that as peace. But furthermore, we say that moving on from the opening government, we see on the closing government that agendas change according to time. So even if a state like France was willing to engage in the Rwandan crisis, as the crisis went on, France lost interest because of different changing agendas of UK and the United States. So we see that even the willing powers actually lose their willingness in the tangle and jumble of international consensus, which was never reached anyhow in Rwanda and Darfur and yes, NC.
How can, if you give the power individual decision related intervention, how can you guarantee nobody is going to abuse this chance?
I don't think we can guarantee that nobody will abuse it, because simply put, individual states do act upon their power. But what we want to notice is that if countries, despite their intent, number one, we think intention is good. We think people go in to save other lives. But number two, even if we assume it's evil, they want it for oil, whatever their intentions is, as long as they go in and stop killing, as long as they prevent families from being destroyed and societies from deteriorating, we think humanitarian intervention is worth pursuing. Sit down, yeah. So moving on from to our second extension, we believe, number one, there are already willing and capable powers like the United States, the United Kingdom, and the rest of the European Union nations that want to intervene unilaterally and independently for the powers of UNSC. But number two, we believe that there are willing powers also who are in necessity of a humanitarian intervention. Now, we've seen cases of humanitarian crisis actually being transnational. In other words, when we have Darfur crisis, it's not a matter of just Darfur, but rather we have Darfur refugees moving on to Chad. We've seen cases where, North Korean humanitarian crisis is leading on to China. We've seen transnational movement of refugees and whatnot. However, neighboring countries have a willingness to stop such humanitarian crisis from spreading onto their own country. But they're not capable of doing so because, simply put, they weren't lucky enough to be put in the UN P5 nations. We tell you, we're not only talking about benefiting powerful countries like the United States or United Kingdom. We're talking about countries that are impacted through crises, that want to deal with the crises of their neighboring countries, but are not willing to, are not capable, because the international organizations have not, unfortunately, reached a consensus, ladies and gentlemen. So ultimately, we believe that consensus is already there about genocide. When mass killing is happening, everybody feels a sympathetic need as a nation state to participate. However, when we say that we have willing nations outside the existing international mechanism, why aren't we guaranteeing them a right? Because we believe that's the way to solve humanitarian crises. So for those very reasons, we're very proud to propose this motion.
Thank you, Member of Government. Let's hear from the closing opposition with the Member of Opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, if this is really about the people in Syria, Libya, and other war-torn countries, we think that the discussion we should be having in today's debate shouldn't only take place in the present, but also in the future. We want, in closing opposition, to tell you about the nature of a post-conflict society, how we actually ensure a better rebuilding process for a better country in the future. But furthermore, we think another part of the discussion that is missing in today's debate so far is whether the actor that should be doing this is through international legislation. And we believe very firmly in closing opposition that it falls outside the role of international legislation. So those would be the true prongs of extension I'll be offering you in closing opposition. But before moving on to that, allow me to address four very brief issues in rebuttal. Firstly, on this idea of checks and balances under the status quo. What opening government wanted to come up to do was to tell you about this idea, how the UN and the Security Council is very bad because it impedes our progress in terms of humanitarian intervention. We think that the value of the UN Security Council is such that, because we believe in closing opposition, that there is no universal definition of what humanitarianism is, and it has to take place on a case-by-case basis. It is this sort of legitimacy that we require, because we don't think that each country necessarily has those best interests at heart. And we think that the vast majority of them only care about their self-interest, and we think that you can't simply guarantee that each and every single country will necessarily be nice people. But furthermore, within this point, we also don't think that they can argue this at extremes. Simply because they say the status quo isn't working properly to allow sufficient effectiveness doesn't mean that they need to remove the entire system of checks and balances and remove all systems of accountability altogether. Second of all, on this idea of using international humanitarian law to regulate abuse, because this was the answer that the Prime Minister had to the idea of checks and balances. We think there are several problems here. First of all, there's the idea of a time lag, because what happens in international humanitarian law is that it necessarily takes place after the conflict, and it is necessarily a very long and drawn-out process, which is necessarily retrospective in nature, which means that you can't actually prevent people from dying, you can't actually prevent these sorts of war abuses with international humanitarian law, because it's retrospective. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that it's whether about war crimes are committed, but rather the war itself, whether the war itself is humanitarian in nature, and we don't think that that is what international humanitarian law does do. So, third of all, on this idea of incentivizing countries to take action that opening government also tried to tell us about, we don't think that you incentivize them to take action, because what they're doing is not granting them this obligation and a duty to intervene. They're simply giving them the right to intervene, ladies and gentlemen, which means that these countries don't intervene on a case-by-case basis to solve those humanitarian crises that opening government sees in today's world. We think that there's a huge problem-solution gap there. You don't force them to intervene. They can decide for themselves based on their own national interest about whether they want to intervene. And the fact that you make it unilateral means that they will only decide it on their own state interest, as I will further elaborate in my extension. No, thank you. Lastly, on to closing government, when they were telling us about capable and willing actors. First of all, on this idea of willingness, right? Because they were telling about how neighboring countries actually need this sort of intervention in order to safeguard their own security. We think that this is already dealt with under the status quo, where they can actually ask countries to come and intervene on their part when they actually want to protect their own borders. The status quo doesn't forbid bilateral agreements for security. For example, we say that when the United States actually helped the Philippines crack down on its terrorist situation in the south, we think that this is a very key example of that. But furthermore, we will actually question the level of effectiveness that these actors actually have. Ethiopia unilaterally intervening in Somalia actually hasn't helped the situation at all. If anything, they've only increased tensions within the region because the people are incredibly antagonized. So we don't see the sort of effectiveness coming from the government side. So on to my extension. Firstly, on this idea of the role of international law, something that was missing throughout the entire debate. We think that international law, ultimately by its very nature, is something that is based on an international consensus. When you have legislation such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, those are based on internationally recognized values that we all hold dear. And we therefore think that the enforcement mechanism by which we give these sorts of legislation meaning and give them real application in the world is something that also needs to have a sort of international consensus for that legislation to have any sort of legitimacy and for it to still continue to be called international law in its truest sense. We don't think that law is simply about urgency, as closing government would like to tell you. It's about achieving justice in the eyes of the international public so that they don't lose faith in the institution of international law. We think that countries will necessarily act within their own self-interest, and we think that's bad. But before moving on to that opening.
Please tell us the point of this international consensus, if it can be brought down by a single veto.
Sir, first of all, you're still arguing on the extreme. All you're doing is telling us that the Security Council is bad. You're not telling us that international consensus as an institution is bad. But furthermore, we think that ultimately the veto power exists because it also manages to safeguard the security of the world. That ultimately you still don't allow for one country to unilaterally decide the fate of another country. And we don't think that any country should be imposing on them. We think that the point about unilateralism is that if one government thinks so, they can do it. And we don't think that without these sorts of checks and balances, because we say that the accountability of those countries, such as the United States, is only to their own people, they will answer only to the needs of their own people, and therefore they will only intervene when there's a compelling state interest. That is why we have documents like the Powell Doctrine that states exactly that. They only intervene when there's a state interest, because you're using national resources, you're doing it for the national people, and only for them. So furthermore, onto my second extension of the organic development of a war-torn country. We think you need a couple of things here. First of all, you actually need to have those social institutions to ensure that that country can run in a post-conflict society. We think that a better way to do that is to let them build them up on their own, rather than create the perception that after this unilateral intervention, it is those Western powers that are imposing their values on them and creating those institutions for them and decrease their faith in them. So we take the example of, say, Afghanistan, where people actually perceive Hamid Karzai as merely a puppet of the United States because this government was set up by the United States and not by their own people. People lack faith in these sorts of institutions when it's not made by them through a very long process that may be painful but is ultimately useful for them in the long run. We also think, second of all, that it helps them build an identity. What the Rwandan genocide did for Rwanda, yes, we acknowledge that a lot of people died, but we think that this is a painful process that ultimately has its own value. It ensures longer lasting peace, because what it does is that the people of Rwandans themselves realize that ultimately there's no such distinction between Hutus and Tutsis, and ultimately they are all Rwandans who want peace within their own backyard. But what you do with a unilateral intervention is that you polarize opinion because you necessarily only side with one particular side in the conflict. You leave the other side incredibly antagonized and not willing to engage in any sort of long-lasting peace negotiation, or even if they do, it won't be long-lasting because they don't actually acquiesce with it from the bottom of the heart. Ladies and gentlemen, this side of the House truly understands how the post-conflict societies think, and that is why we take today's debate.
Let's hear from the government whip.
Madam Speaker, as a whip speaker of the closing government, I am absolutely outraged to see this opposition bench seem to think that watching and see people dying and not doing anything is justice. We own the closing government, Madam Speaker. I'd like to tell you that international law, the current status quo system has failed to serve the justice that we should serve, watching people dying. So we think that it is time for us to allow other capable and willing actors to participate and stop the mass killings that are happening in the continent of Africa and other parts of the world. So on that principle, I'd like to talk about three questions in today's debate. First, I'm going to talk about the urgency of this humanitarian crisis that are happening. And second, I will also talk about the willingness and the capable actors in participating in comparison to international organizations that so seem to believe in. And thirdly, I will also talk about the impact after the intervention is done in both contexts of international organization and also the nation states intervening. But before I do that, let me take a look at the opposition's points. The first point I'd like to talk about is that they say the selective intervention would happen. But Madam Speaker, if you look at the closing opposition's point, you'll probably also notice that those problems are already happening in the status quo. And what we think is more problematic with that is because we not only see that problem occurring in the status quo, but also see any of the cases being solved, Madam Speaker. We see these problems at the same time people are still dying and no one is willing to act. No one is capable of acting because of the current system that blocks such willingness, Madam Speaker. No, thank you. Therefore, we think that their case doesn't really bring you any new harms of each state intervening in humanitarian crisis. We think their case falls. And also on the second point about this international law and goal of international law, they say that international consensus is so important. But Madam Speaker, let me question you that how is international law serving justice when it's turning blind eye to the mass killings that are happening in Darfur, mass killings that happened in Rwanda, and mass killings that are still happening in so many other parts of the world, including Syria. And we think that international law has failed to serve what they want to say, justice. So we think that international law is simply ineffective in solving the problem. And also they want to talk about this P5. Madam Speaker, among the P5, we already have a humanitarian crisis happening, don't we? We see Chinese government killing off people in Tibet and Uyghur. We also have Russia engaging in wars against Chechnya and hurting Georgia. And how can we trust these people to be, willing to make humanitarian intervention consensus, Madam Speaker? And that is actually the reason why China and Russia has been so reluctant to make consensus within the P5 system on the humanitarian intervention because they fear to be attacked by other nations. We think that the system itself is simply inefficient. And going into the first question that I'd like to discuss about the urgency of the issue, but yes, ma'am. we said in the case of Libya, there was an international consensus, it was successful. Then why are you saying that it's impossible? Speaker, we think it's simply inefficient because on the Libyan case, because oil is involved, you are willing to take action. But on the other hand, on the Darfur, where more people die, about like 2 million displaced, over 100,000 dying, you turn to simply blind eye. And how can you say that the system is working? No, thank you. So going back to the first question of the urgency issue, Madam Speaker already told you how mass killing and genocide are occurring in other parts of the world. We also told you from the opening government how the international organization has been very ineffective in solving the problem. We also told you how it takes too long, so oftentimes it either ends by killing so many people, or you simply watch the conflict continue. And also we told you how certain willingness is blocked by other nations such as China and Russia, and also my first speaker has told you that. We also see number of death tolls keep on increasing. So we think that by the time we reach a consensus, most of the times it's over. And that's probably the problem why we think that, until it becomes a genocide, we have to wait and see how many people die, and then see, oh, that seems to be a genocide. And by the time it's too late. So we think that the urgency is actually there. We also say simply because international organizations doesn't function and nation states are blocked from entering into the sea, we see more damages being caused in the arena, especially in the case of Rwanda and other cases. We're also so therefore we see that there is a deep urgency in the issue that requires each state to act if you are willing, also able to do it. And then going into the second question of willingness and capability. We already seen several cases of the nation states making a successful development in the cases of humanitarian intervention. We saw United Kingdom going into Sierra Leone when it was suffering from civil war brokered by Charles Taylor of Liberia. UK entered it, ended the civil war, and actually arrested Charles Taylor and turned him to the ICC. So we see actually that certain nation states are capable and also willing to help out. And in that case, why should we block such people from doing so when we can actually get the guy who caused all the problems and turn him to the justice system? We also think that certain nations are deeply affected by the issue of a humanitarian crisis. My first speaker already told you how the Chad has been deeply affected by the Darfur crisis, the nation being unstable. We also have Zaire, who actually the country disappeared because of the Rwandan case, and the new government of Congo had to come. And we think that these kind of cases, the neighboring states have a deep interest, including the state's survival at the stake. And why do we not allow these actors to engage in such a dire issue for them? We think that should be allowed, and we see these willing and capable actors in intervening in the situation and improving the situation. And then goes to the impact that the closing opposition seems to say that the loss of the confidence in the government and also loss of the confidence in the government. But Madam Speaker, we're willing to tell you that yes, maybe Arzakai doesn't really have that much of confidence in his people, but we don't really see Arzakai killing off his own people, do we, Madam Speaker? And we think that's a definite improvement in Afghanistan. If we don't have a government deliberately killing off its people for whatever reason that they have, we think that's a definite improvement, and that should be done in whatever means. We think that simply saying that they have less trust in the government system, so it will somehow, be sad, is not really the case, because you'll be even more sad when your families die and the people of your countries die. So we think that actually it brings more positive changes within the society, that actually the killing will be stopped and the dire issues related to humanitarian crisis will stop. And that is exactly what closing government and including the opening government want to see in today's debate. We want the killing to stop, and if you sit and watch, nothing is going to change, Madam Speaker. Keep that in mind and vote for the government side or closing government.
We thank the last speaker of the government bench. Let's have the last speaker of the entire debate, the opposition whip.
Ladies and gentlemen, throughout this entire debate on the government bench, we've seen examples of international humanitarian violations and somehow assumed successes where interventions had happened. We believe that this is fundamentally different from the model that they're proposing because the effects of this model are different from the examples that they have utilized. So this has been kind of a strange debate. Now let's talk about the three clashes that we're bringing for you today. Firstly, we're going to talk about what kind of countries are actually going to be intervening in this case, because there was a clear clash between these capable, kind, willing countries and the kind of countries that we're talking about, ones who have political interests that are exactly as corrupt and mean and horrible as the ones that of the states on the UNSC itself. And the second clash we're bringing for you is the nature of checks and balances, why it's necessary and why it's missing in this case. And thirdly, our point is what happens in the state after this intervention happens and what we want to happen in the state after this intervention happens. Okay. So firstly, in terms of what kind of countries intervene, we believe that, look, we recognize that sometimes in cases like Rwanda, there are capable countries who want to go in there, but we want you to compare the harms in this situation. On the UNSC, the members were carefully chosen. It's not random states like, Iran and Afghanistan, these states who could otherwise claim humanitarian intervention without checks and balances. It's states who have stable governments, states who are susceptible to international pressure. These are states who are carefully chosen. Now, we want you to compare that with the harm, sit down guys, with the harm of unilateral action without checks and balances. Even if it sometimes stops in the, guys, sit down. Even if it's sometimes stopped in this situation, we believe that the harms are clearly larger in the model that they're proposing. And even in cases where, sorry, guys, sit down. Okay, now let's talk about how the kinds of countries who will actually intervene in these situations are actually doing so based on political interest. We believe fundamentally that these actors are doing so based on political interest, and the model that they're proposing will increase this incentive to base their actions on political interest even more. Because what we have told you in our extension is basically a decision-making analysis about how, when there are no checks and balances, states no longer feel the need to make any distinctions between which scenarios are going to be successful, which ones are not, which ones are in accord with people's opinions, which ones are not, and which ones actually have a good effect on the nation itself. Okay, and in such situations, it's very difficult for us to actually tell you that in the absence of checks and balances as this model has proposed, it will ever be successful, it will ever be good for the country itself. Let's take closing, go ahead.
So if you let the current government continue killing, that what is the significant harm that you're proposing to allow these guys to continue the killing and continue to violate human rights?
Right. I think that we need to make a serious distinction between the short-term harms that, look, we all agree that killing people are bad, but sometimes the long-term development is better. And I'm going to be telling you more about that in my third clash. Now, in terms of the second clash, about these checks and balances, let's firstly talk about why these checks and balances are necessary. We've already told you that in terms of the state's actual motivations, states think for themselves. They are subject to the opinions of their own people, and they're subject to the opinions of the international community only insofar as checks and balances do exist. Therefore, we believe that checks and balances are necessary because we need the veto so that we don't intervene every time someone dies. So this is the situation. Because, as our extension has told you, human rights are very vaguely defined. I want you guys to actually give me a substantial, okay, fine, that's kind of a lot to ask, because it's impossible to actually give us an exhaustive list of the human rights that you want to go in there to protect. Guys, sit down. So, in terms of this, we believe that the veto is necessary so that we can make those important distinctions between situations where humanitarian intervention is necessary, it can help, and the countries who are going to do it are actually ones that are successful, and doing so that they can't go in there and install a puppet government or something along those lines. And therefore, we believe that checks and balances are essentially missing in this list, because the Prime Minister came up here and basically told you in her last minute of the speech that we believe that there's somewhat possible to have checks and balances under this model, and therefore it could potentially happen, but we believe that's not good enough, because the veto power in the UNSC is pretty much the only way in which there are checks and balances on the actions of the people who are in the UNSC. We believe that a better way to approach it is precisely what's happening in the status quo, where people are forced to make these distinctions, are forced to listen to the General Assembly, the general consensus that exists in the international community, so that in cases where, like in Libya, there's actually substantial support on the ground, where there's a chance of success, where the states that want to go in there can do a lot of help in a very small amount of time, the General Assembly decides that, look, this is a good idea, we can all go in now. Okay, now let's talk about my third clash, about how we want and we care about the long-term development of the state that we're actually talking about. Because you guys are making a very fluffy case about how human rights are good, and we care about those too. We don't want people to die ever, but guess what? We also don't want them to be put in a cycle of installing systems that eventually have the same problems that they do now. Let's take one from opening, go ahead.
Yeah, look, we never said we were going to abolish war crimes. Those check and balances still exist. So please tell us how our policy is going to bring this extra incremental harm.
Certainly, sir. So look, if we're actually basing the idea of humanitarian intervention on the crimes that currently exist in international law, we believe that this idea is so vague that it's literally impossible for you guys or for any state to tell us which exact situations are big enough or severe enough or serious enough for us to go in. And what happens is these states can manipulate that according to their own political interests because they no longer have an obligation to justify their own actions to anyone anymore because you took away the only check and balance that actually existed in this situation. Okay, so now let's talk about the state where this intervention is actually happening. We recognize that in the short term, it's extremely painful. It's very hard for us to watch all of these people dying on TV. It really is. But in the long term, what we want is for these countries to actually develop a system in which these things won't happen anymore so that they can regulate themselves. Because we recognize that these countries can't actually go in there every 10 years and topple this government and install a new government. That's simply not realistic. And guess what? It's actually bad for the people on the ground. Now, why will this actually be the case in the model that they're installing for you and not in one that happens in the status quo and through organic development? It's because in this model, you don't have to make a distinction between the states where intervention is actually going to help them and where you're not going to help them. Now, in the situations where you're not going to help them, where there are no institutions on the ground, there's no middle class, there's no institutions, there's nothing that's actually going to develop a sustainable democracy or any kind of government that you guys think are the best, honestly, we believe that what's going to happen is the power vacuum that I previously talked about in the Syrian debate. So, the power vacuum is going to happen, the social institutions are going to be gone, and what's going to happen, as we told you in our extension, is that you're going to lead to exactly the same problems that you have now. And because of the lack of checks and balances, people are just going to want to go in there again. I'm getting really tired of this. Thank you, guys.
We thank all the debaters. Cross the floor, shake hands.